My name is Audrey Pearson, and I am the great-great-granddaughter of the A.W. Kellys, who are one of the first permanent white settlers in Jamestown, and the great-granddaughter of the Chenrys, especially Jenny Chenry, my great-grandmother, who wrote extensively about the early days of Jamestown. And the reason I'm here at Fort Seward is that I have a doll that was given to my great-grandmother by Custer's soldiers when they left Fort Seward to go to Little Bighorn. And I'd always known that I had this doll and there was this historic connection, but I finally had a chance to go to Little Bighorn, and I had two names that my great-grandmother mentioned in her little book on the history of Jamestown, and they were Captain Weir and Captain Keogh. And I expected to find like a line or something about these obscure soldiers. And I did not at all know that they were both very important people in the history of the story of Little Bighorn and in the battle itself. So I came here to Fort Seward in Jamestown to find out more information about them and try to put the pieces together with this doll, my great-grandmother's writing, both in the book and in the writing of the family stories, and the history of Little Bighorn, but also more importantly, these human beings that my great-grandmother admired greatly. As she talks about what a handsome man Captain Keogh was, and how it must have been a great tragedy in her life that these handsome soldiers that she admired so greatly rode off and all died on the battlefield at Little Bighorn. And it's also the history of Little Bighorn and the history of the American frontier, not from the perspective of generals and important people, but the perspective of a little girl who lived through history, who's also my great-grandmother. Yeah, she talks about how it was, in her book, she talks about how the winters were very cold and dreary, but it was a great event when the soldiers came. And I now understand that my great-great-grandfather was a merchant. So the supplies came by rail to Fort Seward and then had to go up to Fort Totten. So my great-great-grandfather was probably involved in that commerce, and it's likely the soldiers came back and forth between Fort Seward and Fort Totten. So it would have been a great event, and my great-grandmother would of course known, because they were coming to get supplies that my great-great-grandfather would have been involved in, to have them come. So she talks about dinners in the tent with like handsome Captain Keogh. And now that I understand more about him, that he was in the Papal Guard and he was Irish, I mean, he was Irish, so I bet he could spin a pretty good tale. And he would have had this admiring little girl and maybe, you know, more of the children of the fort. And she talks about, you know, going to school with the officers at the fort. So she was certainly in a certain class in the society by, you know, associating with the officers' children. But it was more that, you know, imagine the life of a little girl, you know, on the frontier who only knows tents and cold and winter, hearing about Ireland and, you know, Italy and going overseas and being a battle of the Civil War. And it must have been incredibly remarkable, you know, to hear all these stories of a world that would be as foreign to her at the time as someone coming from Mars would be for us. And so it must have been a great tragedy for her when he was lost. And she does write about Crazy Horse in her writings, and I now know that connection because it was Keogh who directly engaged Crazy Horse. So there's many stories and all these letters and unpublished manuscripts and all this stuff within my family that's actually living history, and history of one little girl at the time. No, I think it was Keogh that was the charmer. As I said, he was Irish, so I bet that had something to do with it. But yeah, and I'm pretty sure, given she talks about going to dinner at his tent and everything, that he was the one who gave her the doll. And the other thing is that doll is like over 100 years old, and it's passed through 3 or 4 generations. And so it was important enough for her that she kept it, and must have given it to my grandmother, who gave it to my mother, who gave it to me. And you know, it was under the bed. I didn't even know about it until she, you know, one day, let me show you something. This was your great-grandmother's doll, and it was given to her by Custer's soldiers. And I sort of went, wow. And it, you know, stayed safely under the bed for probably 30 years, since my grandmother passed away in the 1970s. And now I have this doll, and it is a direct link to my great-grandmother. And the doll is a story, and I want to understand the story behind it. But it was obviously important to her because she kept it. Well, she and her brother were the first white children in Jamestown. They weren't born here, but they were the first white children. But she saw, like, she talks about riding on the plains, the open wild plains as a little girl. My grandmother, her daughter, played in buffalo willows as a kid. So she would have seen the opening and the closing of the frontier. She would have seen the buffalo. She would have seen the Sioux in the old ways, before everything changed. And she died in 1949, so she saw a huge amount of change. And Jamestown, at the era when she was a young woman, there was the opera house. There was a tremendous society that was brought in by the railway. And it was, there was thriving times in Jamestown, I think probably until the Depression. Right. And then certainly the Second World War. But she was a member of a society in a small frontier town. And the fact that my grandmother went to university, which was unusual for a woman at the time, but coming from, not coming from the Eastern class of, social class, was really quite remarkable. And so learning must have been important to her, and she played a role in society. We restored her wedding dress that was at the museum in Bismarck, and I think it was the first formal wedding in Jamestown at Grace Episcopal Church that my great-great and great-grandparents helped found. And it was a society wedding. It was a society dress. It was sewn by machine that would have just been invented. So she was a society lady in a small town and a very prominent citizen. And it's like, wow, she was doing all this stuff and giving speeches before women had the chance to vote. So I come from a remarkable line of remarkable women. Yeah, that was my impression from reading things, and the story I told you that my great-great-grandparents had the Yankonte Sioux had powwows and would stay on their land, and the family story is that there were my great-great-grandmother was out watching outside, and there were the Sioux and my great-grandmother Jenny as a little girl, and then my great-great-grandmother looked out and there were no Sioux and no little girl, and so of course she called her husband, help, and so he rode up to the encampment, and there in the middle of the circle was my great-grandmother as a little girl, and the women and children never left the encampment. So they had brought this little white girl that no one had ever seen before, a white child, up to show their women and children. So my great-great-grandfather just rode into the circle and said, "It's time for Jenny to come home now," and picked her up and rode off, which shows a tremendous cultural sensitivity, or at least coolness at the time, because you think a little girl with the heathen devils, all kinds of horrible things might happen, but he seemed to be quite grounded about it. And apparently he did start by prospecting in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and he spoke at least a couple of the native languages. And as a merchant, he probably had to make deals. Like, I'm sure there was money to be made in buffalo robes, and I was also thinking, gee, I wonder how many of the guns at Little Bighorn were sold by my great-great-grandfather to the Sioux. So there were those kind of connections. But I think that if you were a savvy merchant, you wanted to keep your customers happy and keep on both sides of the divide. And from what other people have told me, there wasn't an overt hostility between the Sioux here and in Jamestown and in Fort Seward at the time when my great-great-grandparents would have come in 1872 when Fort Seward was started and came over from Fort Totten. And I mean, even reading some of the stuff of Custer, these were noble, handsome, intelligent people who were very resourceful and knew how to survive on the land and live well. And I think that at the time, I think the pioneers would have at least had some respect for their abilities, and many people learned, how to fish, how to hunt, what to get. They learned from the native people around them because they've been doing it for a very long time. And I think that native people, they traded, everyone traded back and forth between peoples, so they would have at least had some respect. They probably drove a pretty hard bargain, and you didn't get away with cheap stuff because they learned really quickly. People learn really quickly. That's what these people like, buffalo robes. Okay, we want that, and it would have been in their interest to be able to do that. But I think that there was a respect for people and in their skills and their abilities as hunters. I mean, I've seen a male buffalo. Those things are huge. Like trying to take a buffalo down with a gun, never mind galloping on horseback with something 1 ton riding beside you, was really quite a skill. And I'm sure that at least, maybe it was begrudging, but there would have been some respect shown for the skills people had in the old days. The Chenrys stayed. My great-grandfather died in the 20s, and my great-grandmother died in 1949, I believe, and they kept the Chenry hardware store going. The Kelly side of the family left to California during the Depression. I guess they couldn't make do, but the Beamans stayed, and the three daughters, only my grandmother went to Toronto, and the Beamans, Francis and Claudine Henry, stayed. And my mother's cousin was Theodore Colonel Beaman, who went into the drink in Pearl Harbor and was on the USS Missouri when the Japanese surrendered, and he actually spent time in post-war Japan, which is why I have all this occupied Japan stuff now that was all over the house.
Well, thank you for your interest in Jamestown.
Oh yeah, well, it's wonderful to find the personal connections, and that it makes the history of my family real, because it was an ordinary person like me living through it.